On July 26, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed into law the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure that those of us with disabilities have full civil rights and can lead lives free of discrimination and stigma. In this summer of 2015, we are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is also known as the ADA. In essence, the ADA created a national mandate for ending discrimination against those of us with disabilities. And like any movement for civil rights among devalued people, whether that be the civil rights movement or the women's movement, the disability rights movement did have national leaders who were on the national stage helping to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act. Some of the names that come to mind are great leaders like Justin Dart and Judy Chamberlain, Fred Fay, Ed Roberts, Frank Bowe, just to name a few of our national leaders. But again, like any other movement for civil rights, a lot of the work was done at the grassroots level. And I'd like to take a little bit of time to share with you, my perspective as someone who was working at the grassroots level to help raise disability rights awareness at the local level and to help get the ADA passed. So in the beginning, I didn't think of myself as having a disability. Definitely I'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia, but I thought of schizophrenia as something that existed within me as a disease or as a disorder, and when I was having severe symptoms, that I was disabled by those symptoms. But as I began to hang out with other people in the disability rights movement, people who were using wheelchairs, folks who were deaf and hard of hearing, folks who were blind and had other sensory impairments, I began to understand that disability is not just something that resides in me, but is also socially constructed. What I mean by that is, when you think about it, if you're using a wheelchair and you're trying to get from here to the voting booth, and all there is a set of stairs leading up to the voting booth, is the fact that you're using a wheelchair and have a spinal cord injury really disabling? Or is what the true disability is the true disability that there is no ramp that will allow me to access that voting booth? In other words, what's disabling is not the fact that I can't, or that I have a spinal cord injury. What's disabling is that there is a set of stairs that prevent me from reaching the voting booth. That's what's disabling. Or the fact that I can't get around campus in a wheelchair because there are no curb cuts and I can't get down from the sidewalks safely. That's disabling me and preventing me from being able to go to college. So in the beginning, I really thought that disability was something that resided within me. But after talking to friends in the disability rights movement, I began to learn that for me, what was disabling was the attitude of my college professors, for instance, when I was in graduate school, who felt that people with a diagnosis of mental illness or schizophrenia like I had, that we couldn't accomplish and work and study like other students, and that I lived in fear of of disclosing that I had a psychiatric disability for fear that my college professors would throw me out of my graduate studies programs, and that it was this fear of discrimination, the fear of the stigma, the fear of being out about who I was that was truly disabling. What was disabling were the attitudes and prejudice and discrimination of my professors in school, and that needed to change. So in the early days of our grassroots disability rights movement, what began to happen is that those of us with all different sorts of disabilities began to talk to each other. And we began to realize that we had really bought into sort of these medical diagnoses that kept us very separated. So they were the blind, there were the deaf and hard of hearing community, there was the mobility impairment community, there was the psychiatric disability community, and we thought that we didn't have much in common, and we allowed these medical diagnoses to create walls between us. But slowly but surely, we began to organize into small consciousness raising and discussion groups. And we began to kind of peer over the wall of our medical labels. And what we began to realize is that in truth, whether you had a mobility impairment, a psychiatric disability, a sensory impairment, that we all actually had more in common than differences. We began to understand that all of us struggled with poverty. All of us struggled with discrimination in education, in opportunity. And most importantly of all, we began to understand that no matter what the label was, we all had hopes and dreams and aspirations of wanting to fulfill our human potential as Americans. And that each way we turned, we encountered stigma, discrimination, prejudice, physical barriers, attitudinal barriers that were keeping us from fulfilling our human potential. And this forged an extraordinary bond between us. And then what we realized is that when we found the common ground of our shared humanity, that we realized there are 43 million Americans with disabilities, not to mention millions of others, supporters and families and friends, and that we comprised a really significant voting bloc, and that we had extraordinary power in our numbers. And with this realization came the absolute belief that we could push through an Americans with Disabilities Act, in effect a kind of emancipation proclamation, to take our full place as Americans with the right to live our lives free of prejudice and discrimination. And so we began to form cross-disability coalitions. We began to keep discrimination diaries. We began to give public speeches and hold public rallies and build sentiment within the media, within television and news and newspapers and magazines about our cause. And this began to light a fire underneath the movement and foment our passion for our rights. And eventually, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And so we live in a different world today than the world I lived in, for instance, in the pre-ADA era. And I can give you a real concrete example of how the ADA has worked in my life. I was setting out with my partner to adopt a marvelous baby girl through the Department of Social Services here in Massachusetts. And the night before we were to go see our daughter for the first time, I was on the news, and I was doing cemetery restoration, and I was outing myself as a person with a history of schizophrenia. And the social worker happened to be watching the news that night, saw me on the news, and when we arrived to meet my daughter, the social worker told me that we weren't to be allowed to see our daughter that day. In fact, the social worker was saying that because of my psychiatric disability, perhaps I didn't qualify as an adoptive parent. Now, mind you, we had passed the coursework, we had passed all of the tests, we had passed all of the same home visits that any other citizen would have to pass in order to be considered ready to adopt a child. We had passed with flying colors. This clearly was an example of discrimination, and I knew my rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I just remember looking at that supervisor, that social worker, and letting her know that I was protected under the ADA. And I could fall back on a knowledge of my rights as a citizen. And she backed down, and we saw our daughter Cheyenne for the first time that day. And today Cheyenne is 18 years old and just graduated from high school, and is just a wonderful, wonderful kid. And so the Americans with Disabilities Act has worked for me, and it's there for you too. Just remember, you are a citizen, you are an American, and you are protected in terms of your civil rights. This is Pat Deegan. Thanks for listening.